All right, Edge leaders, have a special edition of the Fireside Mentoring this morning. Wanted to talk to you about a specific principle that we should all be aware of in ourselves, and especially as we're helping people develop, and it's a concept or principle that helps us understand why people do what they do and different things like that. And so here's a little story to start this off. So I've noticed throughout the years that when I touch base with any of my friends, no matter where they are or when they or how much time has gone by or different things like that, that their story is the same. Maybe you've noticed this. I remember having one friend one time that I would show up. No matter where they lived in the world, they did move several times, but when I'd go to their house, the outside, the lawn was always a disaster, but you'd get inside and the house would always be immaculate. I mean, just pristine, everything was clean, everything was in order, the whole thing. And then they moved across the country. I showed up at their house, same story, outside of the yard, just disaster. Not really a disaster, but just not highly kept or anything. Get inside, pristine environment, everything's put away, super clean like that. And I thought it was interesting because one day I was driving out of my driveway, and I drove up, and by this time I'd known the neighborhood pretty well, and I realized that everybody's lawn was reflecting their fundamental attitudes and habits that they'd developed. So I drove by one yard. Of course, it was all weeds and it was just basically nothing on it, but just weeds and uncut. And every once in a while, it would be mowed, but barely taken care of. And then right next door was a lawn that looked like they had used a ruler to cut all the grass, and all the trees were perfectly pruned. And as I drove down the neighborhood, I was making an account of each one of these homes and kind of assessing the yard and realizing that it was reflecting directly on the the basic fundamental operating programs inside each of these individuals. And I found it ironic how reflective the yard was of the person that was the steward over that yard. And that started to cue me in between various of my friends. When I'd call them up, the story would be exactly the same. It might be different components, different areas, different names and things like that, but fundamentally it was the same. And so I started to call this principle the 5-year loop. Now here's what's significant about that, and here's what goes on in the brain. For example, as soon as you do something, if you or learn something or anything like that, inside your brain there's a series of neural pathways that are formed. So as soon as you do an action, for example, or learn a new skill, it forms a pathway in the brain. And if you learn a new skill, there's a new pathway. And if you have a new action, there's a new pathway. And if you repeat the action over and over, it starts to form a literal flowway. Okay? So you repeat the same activity or thing over and over and over again, and then this becomes the field of comfort in your brain. So when you repeat certain activities over and over and over again, it forms a neural pathway in your brain, and that becomes what your brain interprets as normal. And so it always feels in its safe place or its zone of comfort when you're continuing on in the status quo. But anytime you add something transitionary to that, learning a new skill or adopting or forcing yourself into a new habit, then there's a new pathway that's formed, and that causes a sense of fear in the mind, and it creates a level of discomfort. In other words, this is foreign ground. We don't know where we're headed. We feel insecure. Fears start to rise. And so when that happens, we tend to retreat and then go back to our fundamental operating brain behaviors, and we continue along that pathway because that's where we feel confident or secure or things like that. And so the key to development of habit or breaking your cycles is to get consistent in a new or more positive action step, okay? And so what I've found is that basically your series of actions and attitudes and beliefs, and again, this falls back to your value system and your belief system, is creating a loop, and it's causing your life to go like this, cycle. And basically, if this cycle goes on, that, again, that's your field or your field of security, your comfort zone, or things like that, okay? And, but what's happening is it's recreating your story, basically every 5 years. And this becomes a good predictor of human behavior. For example, if you understand how people habitually operate, you essentially can predict their future. The same thing with yourself. If you understand how the habits that you've ingrained in your body, you can fundamentally predict your future because it will cycle over and over and over again unless you change this. Now, what the big fundamental words here that enact change in your 5-year loop is the term values and your beliefs. All right? Now, when I recognized that I had a continuous loop that was going in my life, and it was forming itself in the terms of business and entrepreneurship. So, for example, I had certain belief patterns that were causing me to make decisions in specific ways, and when I was making those decisions in specific ways, it was recreating the same results over and over again. So in entrepreneurially, I was rising up, and then there was basically a moment of market catastrophe or whatever, and I had leveraged myself to the hilt, and then of course there'd be economic downturns, and I was repeating this wave so that my life was essentially waving over and over and over again, repeating its cycle. And then one day I pinpointed, and I've continued to pinpoint specific fundamental belief things, or if you pictured your mind like a hard drive of a computer, and then all the stuff you feed into it is the programming that you receive, and then the program, of course, is operating your computer and creating the results in your life. And so what I realized one time is that fundamentally I had a program once where I couldn't figure out why it was difficult for me to do certain things. And so what I was doing is I was getting easily overwhelmed. And I realized one day when I walked into a cooler in a convenience store that I worked for, and my job was to stock it, that I was getting overwhelmed in the stocking process, and I couldn't figure out why. And then it dawned on me that I was seeing the entire picture all at once, and my mind wasn't categorically setting it up. So I started training myself, or retraining my brain, to start with the first product and work down the road sequentially. And that taught me how to to think strategically, and then suddenly I not only could see the big picture, but I also could see the pathway. And it enormously improved myself from that time. Now in this particular one, I had a value system that I had about partnerships. And I realized that I had a belief center that I had interpreted as integrity, for example, that wasn't serving. And once I identified it, I changed the belief, and then from that point on, I wrote a new program. It was very painful, very disruptive. I had formed a new pathway, very disruptive in the beginning, caused lots of drama, things like that. But that storm we eventually got through, and then we got to a new normal. And that normal led me to an ever-increasing or expanding pathway of wealth. But you need to check yourself, because periodically, even in that pathway, I've noticed that I stagnate periodically. and then I have to reassess my value system and belief system on what codes are running in my head that are causing me to fall back in to those old ways. So this is the principle of the 5-year loop. And so if you become aware of what your story is, if you think back every 5-year increment and you tell yourself, okay, what's been my story at each 5-year increment? And you notice that it's the same, and that same story is not necessarily what you want to be associated with. In other words, it's not creating the results that you want. Then at that point you can try to pinpoint or isolate the specific things that might be causing that disruption in your life, and then not be afraid to form a new neural pathway. In other words, recreate your program and walk through the pain and the disruption and drama of that because you know that it will lead to a better way. So I hope that was helpful, and we will talk to you all soon.